The ambition gnawed at Nora's heart, a silent poison that impelled her to inhuman acts. Her mother-in-law's pension, for an 85-year-old woman, frail and burning with a high fever, was all she saw. With calculated coldness, Nora dragged the elderly woman's debilitated body into the depths of the forest, a labyrinth of gnarled trees and a piercing cold that promised to be the end. Nature will take care of it, she thought, leaving her mother-in-law shivering and disoriented in the icy dampness, enveloped by the dense mist that swallowed the last rays of light. But nature, at times, has its own guardians. Suddenly, a colossal shadow emerged from the gloom, a giant tiger with eyes that glowed like embers. Instead of threatening, the beast approached the elderly woman, lying down upon her, enveloping her with the warmth of its soft fur, a protective mantle against the relentless cold. Nora, paralyzed by terror and the surreal vision, tried to flee, but the tiger raised its head and let out a roar so primal and potent that the ground vibrated. The sound echoed through the forest, a warning, a sentence. The villainess, overcome by indescribable dread, felt her legs buckle and collapsed, fainting from terror in the darkness of the forest, while the wild guardian stood vigil over the life that humanity had abandoned. The damp, icy ground was the first thing to register in Nora's clouded consciousness, a cold that seemed to penetrate her bones, more biting than what she had expected for the old woman. Her head throbbed, a dull drumming that echoed the primal roar that had plunged her into the abyss of unconsciousness. Slowly, her eyes opened, heavy, fighting against the dense darkness of the forest, which now seemed even more oppressive. The mist, once an ethereal veil, had transformed into an icy shroud. Memory returned like an electric shock, paralyzing her anew. The tiger, the roar, the terror. Her body, still weak and trembling, tried to move, but every muscle seemed bound by an invisible fear. She lay on her side, her face almost touching the wet earth, and the first image her blurred eyes caught was the colossal silhouette. There he was, the wild guardian, still imposing, still vigilant. Nora's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He hadn't left. It wasn't a nightmare. The creature of nightmares was there, just a few feet away, a monolith of muscle and fur, watching over the life she had condemned. The thin forest air seemed to suck the oxygen from her lungs. She tried to take a deep breath, but only a rasp tore through her dry throat. With a Herculean effort, Nora turned her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the surreal scene. The tiger, with its striped coat that blended perfectly with the shadows and the mist, lay there but not in repose. Its head was raised, its ember eyes, previously focused on the horizon, now seemed to sweep the surroundings, perhaps sensing the intruder's awakening. A shiver ran down Nora's spine. He knew she was awake, and the mother-in-law. The mother-in-law was still there, nestled beneath the gigantic body of the feline. Nora expected to see the pallor of death, the final immobility, but through the mist and the tears of dread that blurred her vision, she swore she saw a slight movement, a more regular breath, perhaps. The beast's warmth, which should have been the old woman's death sentence, seemed, ironically, to be saving her. Rage, a cold fire, began to mix with the terror. Was that old woman indestructible? Ambition, even in the face of imminent death, still whispered in her mind. The pension, the money, everything now seemed a distant dream, guarded by a demon of stripes and claws. She needed to get out of there, she needed to think, but how? The tiger was an insurmountable barrier, a wall of flesh and silent fury. Every beat of her heart was a hammer, every falling leaf a thunderclap. The forest's silence, once just an emptiness, was now filled with a palpable tension, a premonition. She tried to drag herself inch by inch backward away toward the illusory safety of the denser trees, but the slightest movement seemed amplified in the icy air, and the tiger, as if it had a sixth sense, moved its head slightly, its eyes fixed on her for an instant. There was no direct aggression, no new roar, but the gaze. That gaze was more than enough. It was a warning, a promise of annihilation if she dared to approach her mother-in-law. Nora froze again. Her body rigid, her breath caught in her throat. She was prey, and the tiger, the supreme predator, had assumed the role of guardian. Time stretched, elastic and cruel. Minutes felt like hours. The night's cold penetrated her clothes, but fear was an even deeper ice. She looked at her mother-in-law, at the frail body under the mantle of fur, and the image disturbed her. The old woman, who should have been dead, seemed to be receiving vital warmth from her unexpected protector. The fever, perhaps, was subsiding. The idea was unbearable. Nora felt a growing despair. She was trapped between the deadly cold of the forest and the even deadlier threat of the tiger. The pension was there, so close, yet so unattainable. The irony of the situation was a torment. She had dragged her mother-in-law to her death, and now she was the one on the verge of collapse, not from fever, but from terror and helplessness. A subtle sound broke the silence. It didn't come from the tiger, nor from the mother-in-law. It was a distant rustling, a snapping twig. The tiger, previously focused on Nora, turned its head abruptly, ears alert, muscles tense. Its ember eyes narrowed, fixed on something beyond the dense mist, something Nora couldn't see, but which seemed to have captured the giant's attention. A new element of danger, or perhaps an unexpected chance. Nora's heart leapt, a new wave of dread and an infinitesimal spark of hope colliding in her chest. What else did the darkness of that forest hide? The distant rustling and snapping twig. The sound, subtle yet unmistakable, had torn through the veil of immobility that held Nora captive. To her, it was like an electric shock, a new pulse of dread mingled with a dangerous spark of hope. Her eyes, previously fixed on the tiger and her mother-in-law, now turned towards the direction from which the sound had come, although the mist and the darkness of the forest swallowed any sight. Nora's mind, a whirlwind of terror and calculation, began to work frantically. What else did the darkness of that forest hide? And, more importantly, what did it mean for her own survival? The tiger, however, needed no sight. Its senses were keen, primitive. Its ears, previously slightly relaxed, now stood fully erect, swiveling like radar, catching every nuance of the icy air. The muscles of its colossal body, previously in vigilant repose, tensed, ready for action. A low growl, almost inaudible to human ears, vibrated in its chest, a guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It was not a warning roar, but a warning of possession, a sign that its territory, and perhaps its unexpected charge, was under threat. Nora felt the ground vibrate slightly with the animal's tension. Whatever was approaching, it was something the tiger considered a threat. And if it was a threat to the tiger, it would be a catastrophe for her. But what if? What if it was a big enough distraction? A chance to escape, to crawl away before the wild guardian could focus on her again. The idea was a sweet poison, a temptation that fought against the instinct of self-preservation. Fear was ice, but hope, however faint, was a fire that compelled her to consider the unthinkable. The rustling repeated, this time closer, more defined. It was not the sound of a small animal, nor of wind playing with leaves. It was heavy, deliberate, the dragging of something large and cautious. The mist seemed to dance with the approach, and Nora swore she saw a shadow moving at the periphery of her vision, an indistinct form that seemed to merge and separate from the gloom. The air grew heavy, charged with a wild expectation. The tiger rose slowly, a majestic and terrifying movement. Its ember eyes were now no longer fixed on Nora, but riveted in the direction of the sound. Its tail, previously at rest, lashed softly from side to side, a pendulum of contained fury. It did not move away from the mother-in-law. On the contrary, it positioned itself slightly in front of her, its massive body forming an even more impenetrable barrier. The old woman, still under the protective warmth of the fur, seemed oblivious to the new imminent danger, or perhaps the fever kept her in a state of blessed unconsciousness. Nora, on the other hand, was more conscious than ever. Her heart beat like a war drum, echoing in her ears. She was trapped in the middle of a hunting stage, an involuntary spectator and a potential victim. With each passing second, the tension increased, the air grew denser, charged with the damp smell of the earth and the wild aroma of the taiga. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, a cocktail of dread and a survival instinct she had never known she possessed. Then the form emerged from the mist. It was not a tiger, it was a bear. A colossal brown bear with bristling fur and small, cunning eyes that gleamed with its own ferocity. It stopped, sniffing the air, and its eyes fixed on the tiger and the strange scene of the nestled old woman. The forest seemed to hold its breath, two predators face to face in a primal standoff. Nora felt her stomach churn, a knot of terror tightening her throat. The bear let out a deep growl, a challenge. The tiger responded with a louder snarl, showing its sharp teeth, a clear warning that it would not yield. Nora felt an even more intense cold, a cold that did not come from the forest, but from the dread that paralyzed her. She was witnessing a territorial battle, and the mother-in-law, ironically, was the center of this insane dispute. The idea that the old woman could be saved by a tiger and then become the pivot of a fight between beasts was absurd, grotesque. The pension, the money, everything seemed so trivial now. The only thing that mattered was to survive. But how? She was a few feet from two giant wild animals, both capable of tearing her to shreds with a single blow. The bear took a step forward, its head swaying from side to side, assessing its opponent. The tiger, in turn, lowered its head slightly, its front paws firmly planted, ready to attack. Nora closed her eyes for an instant, wishing it was all a nightmare. But the smell of the forest, the sound of the animals, the icy dampness beneath her body, everything was too real. She opened her eyes again, and what she saw made her swallow hard. The bear, with unexpected cunning, did not advance directly. Instead, it began to flank, moving in a slow semicircle, trying to circumvent the tiger to get to. The mother-in-law? No, the mother-in-law did not seem to be the direct target. Perhaps the bear was more interested in what the tiger was protecting, or just testing the limits of the territory. The tiger followed the bear's movement with its eyes, turning its body slightly to maintain the barrier. Its eyes never left the bear, but Nora noticed an even greater tension in the way it positioned itself. It was torn: protect the old woman or face the direct threat. Nora saw a small opening. The bear was distracting the tiger. If she could crawl slowly backward into the denser darkness, perhaps she had a chance. The risk was immense. One wrong move, one sound, and she would become the new focus of one of the predator's fury. But staying there was a slow death sentence. Adrenaline pumped through her veins, a primitive impulse that overcame even terror. She began to move, inch by inch, dragging herself backward, using her hands to push her body across the damp, leaf-covered ground. Every dry leaf that crackled under her weight was a scream in her ears. Every breath was an effort. The bear growled again, and the tiger let out a stronger snarl, a warning that echoed through the forest. The two animals stared at each other, a few feet apart, the tension almost palpable. Nora continued to crawl, her eyes fixed on the predators, hoping they wouldn't notice her. She had managed to move a few feet away. The darkness of the denser trees seemed like a refuge, when a new sound froze her. It wasn't a growl, nor a snarl. It was a whimper, a faint yet unmistakable whimper. It came from the mother-in-law. The old woman, who seemed to be in a deep sleep, had moved. Her eyes, previously closed, were slightly open, and a sound of pain or discomfort escaped her dry lips. The tiger, as if it had a sixth sense for its protected one, turned its head abruptly, not towards the bear but towards the elderly woman. The bear saw the opportunity. With a deafening roar, the bear charged. The tiger, caught by surprise by the momentary distraction, reacted with lightning speed, launching itself against the bear. The forest exploded in fury. Sounds of claws, snarls, roars, and the snapping of broken branches filled the air. Nora, paralyzed by the new horror, saw the two colossi collide, a deadly dance of brute force and wild instinct. The mother-in-law, now more exposed, let out another whimper, stronger this time. And Nora, amidst the chaos, realized that the old woman was looking at her. Her mother-in-law's eyes, blurred by fever and pain, seemed to carry a mixture of confusion and recognition. Nora's terror reached a new peak. She couldn't flee. She couldn't leave her mother-in-law behind, not now that the old woman was conscious and had seen her, but staying there meant being crushed in the battle of the Titans. The pension, the revenge, everything dissolved into a single silent scream of despair. She was trapped, completely trapped. The bear's roar and the tiger's counterattack tore through the mist, transforming the previously silent forest into a stage of primal fury. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration that ran through the ground, climbed the tree roots, and resonated in Nora's bones. The clash of the two colossi was brutal, an impact of flesh and muscle that made the air crackle. Guttural cries, deep growls, and the dry sound of claws scraping earth and hide mingled in an infernal symphony. Thick branches snapped under the force of the moving bodies, and the damp earth was churned, releasing a smell of moss and fear. Nora, still crawling, froze. Her wide eyes witnessed the battle. The tiger, with its feline agility, tried to flank the bear, while the bear, a mountain of brute force, tried to crush its adversary with the weight of its body. It was a deadly dance, too fast for her eyes to fully process, yet slow enough that every blow, every scratch, every bite seemed to last an eternity. Blood, dark and warm, began to stain the fur of both animals, a silent testament to the ferocity of the confrontation. The mother-in-law's whimper, faint and almost inaudible beneath the clamor of the fight, pierced Nora's terror. The old woman, who had previously seemed an inert burden, was now a point of vulnerability, a magnet for danger. Her eyes, blurred by fever, were fixed on Nora, a mixture of pain and a strange lucidity. In that gaze, Nora saw not only recognition, but perhaps a silent question, an accusation that struck her deeper than any roar. The pension, the money, the house, everything dissolved into smoke before that scene. What mattered now? Life, hers, the old woman's. A knot of guilt and dread tightened her throat. She couldn't flee. She couldn't leave her mother-in-law behind, not now that the old woman was conscious and had seen her. But staying there meant being crushed in the battle of the Titans. The tiger, despite its ferocity, seemed to be at a disadvantage. The bear was larger, heavier, and its blows were devastating. It tried to bite the tiger's neck, which dodged with impressive reflexes, but each dodge moved it a little further from the mother-in-law. The protective barrier it formed was breaking down. The old woman, now more exposed, let out another moan, and Nora saw the bear cast a quick glance in her direction, as if it perceived the tiger's distraction. A new dread settled in Nora. The bear wasn't just fighting for territory. It seemed to have an interest in the elderly woman, or in what the tiger was protecting. Was it easy prey, or a predator's curiosity? Nora's mind spun, searching for an exit, any exit. But there was nowhere to go. The surrounding trees were a wall of darkness, and the mist seemed to thicken, swallowing any glimpse of hope. She cowered even further, trying to merge with the damp ground. Every muscle in her body trembled. The smell of blood and animal sweat was nauseating. The sound of the fight was deafening, but amidst it, Nora could hear the frantic beat of her own heart, a death drum in her ears. Suddenly, the tiger let out a roar of pain. The bear had landed a blow, perhaps a deep bite to its hind leg. The tiger stumbled, and the bear seized the opportunity, advancing with surprising speed for its size, not towards the tiger, but in an arc, aiming for the mother-in-law. Nora saw the scene in slow motion. The bear, with its enormous claws, approached the frail figure of the old woman. The tiger, wounded, tried to recover, but it was too late. A scream of horror escaped Nora's throat, a hoarse, desperate sound she barely recognized as her own. It was a scream of dread, but also of a strange and belated protection. But the bear did not reach the mother-in-law. At the last instant, when its claws were inches from the old woman, an even larger and darker shadow emerged from the mist. Not from the ground, but from above. A thunderous sound like thunder echoed through the forest. A colossal form, with gigantic wings and a beak sharp as a blade, descended upon the bear with dizzying speed. It was an eagle. Not an ordinary eagle, but a creature of mythical proportions, with a wingspan that seemed to cover the night sky. Its talons, like steel hooks, dug into the bear's back, which let out a roar of pain and surprise, turning to attack the new aggressor. The scene became even more chaotic. 3 gigantic predators fighting in an insane ballet of life and death. The bear, now with the tiger in front and the eagle on its back, was at a disadvantage. The eagle, with precise strikes of its beak, aimed for the bear's eyes, while the tiger, recovering, attacked its paws and flanks. Nora was in complete shock. Her eyes widened, unable to process the unreality of the situation. A giant eagle, in that forest. Her thoughts of pension and revenge were now as distant as the stars. She was in a living nightmare, a theater of horrors where wild nature showed its most relentless and grandiose face. The mother-in-law, for her part, seemed to have found a moment of peace amidst the chaos. Her eyes closed again, the whimper ceased, and she seemed to sink into a feverish sleep, oblivious to the new winged threat and the battle unfolding around her. Or perhaps nature had granted her the mercy of unconsciousness. Nora, however, was not so lucky. She was more awake than ever, every fiber of her being vibrating with terror. The eagle, the bear, the tiger. It was too much. Her mind, already fragile, began to give way under the pressure. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her body was paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the eagle that now tried to lift the bear from the ground with its powerful talons, saw something more. At the base of a nearby tree, hidden by the mist, there was a metallic gleam. An object. It was small but distinct. A knife? A tool? No, it was a softer, more organic gleam. It looked like an amulet, or perhaps a small statuette. It was a distraction, an insignificant detail in the midst of the animal apocalypse, but for Nora's desperate mind, it was a point of escape, a focus for her terror. What was it? And why was it there? The question, however absurd, was the only thing preventing her from fainting again. She needed an explanation, something, anything, that made sense in that hell. The image of the colossal eagle, its steel talons embedded in the bear, was a delusion that refused to disappear. Nora blinked, trying to shake off the vision, but it persisted, real and terrifying. The bear roared, no longer in fury but in pain and despair, struggling under the aerial and terrestrial attack. The tiger, taking advantage of the distraction, delivered precise blows to the bear's hind legs, trying to immobilize it. The eagle, in turn, did not give up, its beak sharp as a dagger, aiming for the terrestrial predator's most vulnerable points. It was a carnage, a macabre ballet of instincts and survival, and Nora was the only human spectator trapped in the center of the stage. Her eyes, however, could not fix solely on the battle. That metallic gleam at the base of the tree continued to call to her. It was a point of light amidst the darkness of chaos, an anomaly that her mind, on the verge of collapse, clung to like a shipwrecked survivor to a piece of wood. She strained her eyes, trying to discern what it was. It was not a knife nor a tool. It seemed a small statuette, perhaps of an animal, a bird, perhaps, or a feline. The mist and distance distorted the image, but the feeling that it did not belong in that place was strong. It was artificial, a vestige of civilization in a wild hell. The bear, in a last desperate effort, managed to free itself from the eagle's talons for an instant, rolling on the ground and delivering a blind blow that grazed the tiger. The feline hissed, but did not retreat. The eagle, with a shrill cry that tore the air, descended again, its wings beating with the force of a miniature hurricane, kicking up leaves and dirt. The bear, now bleeding profusely, seemed to be losing the fight. But its fury was palpable, and it was still a colossal threat. Nora felt the ground vibrate beneath her. The smell of blood intensified, mixing with the earthy scent of the forest and animal sweat. She was dirty, wet, and the cold seemed to penetrate her bones, but the adrenaline kept her in a state of feverish stupor. The mother-in-law, still asleep, seemed a pale spectre, her frail body contrasting with the violence around her. Nora felt a strange impulse, almost remorse, seeing her there so defenseless. The pension, the money, everything seemed so insignificant now. Life. Only life mattered. The shining object continued to attract her. It was as if it had an aura, a promise of something different, something that could explain or perhaps offer a way out. The battle of the titans moved, circling the mother-in-law, but always moving slightly away from her, as if the eagle and the tiger were in some way protecting her. Even amidst their own struggle for survival, this perception, however irrational, planted a seed of strange hope in Nora's heart. She began to crawl again, not to flee, but towards the tree where the object lay. Every movement was a risk, every rustling leaf an invitation to death, but curiosity, or perhaps madness, was stronger than fear. She needed to know what it was. She needed a focus, something to divert her mind from the sight of claws and teeth tearing flesh. The bear, in a fit of blind rage, charged the eagle, which rose quickly, avoiding the attack, but the bear's movement brought it dangerously close to Nora. She froze, her heart beating like an uncontrolled drum. The bear, with bloodshot eyes, passed a few feet from her, without even noticing her, its attention entirely focused on the eagle hovering above. The relief was so intense, it almost made her faint. She continued to crawl, her muscles tense, her breath caught in her throat. The metallic gleam was closer now. She could see it better. It was indeed a statuette, but not of an ordinary animal. It seemed to be a stylized humanoid figure, with features resembling an ancient deity, perhaps a forest spirit. It was made of a dark metal, almost black, but polished and inlaid with small stones that glittered with the little light filtering through the mist. It was beautiful and completely out of place. As she approached, the sound of the battle behind her intensified. The tiger let out a roar of fury, and the eagle responded with a sharp cry. It seemed the bear was being cornered, its resistance waning. Nora was almost there, her fingers outstretched, eager to touch the object, to feel its texture, to prove its reality. Suddenly, a different sound, not a roar nor a cry. It was a whisper that seemed to come from the forest itself, from the trees, from the mist. An ancient, almost musical sound that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. It wasn't the mother-in-law. It wasn't any of the animals. It was something more. Ethereal. Nora stopped, her hand inches from the statuette. The whisper became clearer, as if the words were being blown directly into her mind, in a language she didn't know, but seemed to understand. A sensation of intense cold, different from the forest's cold, enveloped her. It was a cold that came from within, a chill in her soul. The statuette, in turn, began to emit a stronger, pulsating glow, like a beating heart. The small stones embedded in it shone with their own light, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding leaves. The mist around the tree seemed to thicken, swirling in a spiral, as if responding to the object. The whisper intensified, and Nora felt a pressure in her mind, an invasion. Images began to emerge in her peripheral vision, quick and confused flashes. Gigantic trees that moved, glowing eyes in the darkness, shadowy forms dancing. It was as if the forest was alive and the statuette was its portal. Nora's terror reached a new level. It was no longer the fear of animals or of physical death. It was the fear of the unknown, of the supernatural, of what was beyond her comprehension. She wanted to pull away, to flee, but she was paralyzed. Her eyes were fixed on the pulsating statuette, and the whisper in her mind transformed into a voice, an ancient and powerful voice that seemed to speak directly to her soul. The voice was not threatening, but it carried an authority that made her tremble. It spoke of balance, of guardians, of an ancient pact. And then a word stood out. A word Nora understood perfectly, though she had never heard it before. Protection. The statuette seemed to be activating something, awakening a dormant force in the forest. The animal battle, which had previously seemed the apex of terror, now seemed merely a prelude to something much larger, something that was about to reveal itself. Nora felt she had stumbled upon an ancient secret, a secret the forest guarded, and that now, for some reason, was revealing itself to her. And the mother-in-law, the old woman she had dragged to her death, was at the center of it all. The pension was a cruel joke, life, death, and now mysticism intertwined in an impossible knot to untangle. She was more than trapped. She was entangled in something that transcended her own existence. Whatever it was just beginning. The word protection echoed in Nora's mind, not as a sound, but as an undeniable truth that had infiltrated every fiber of her being. It was a revelation that distorted everything she thought she knew, everything she believed to be real. The statuette pulsed with a more intense glow, and the forest's whisper was now a clear voice, though still ancient and ethereal, speaking directly to her soul. There was no more room for reason. Nora's sanity was unraveling like mist under the sun, revealing an abyss of mystery and terror. "She is the link," the voice resonated, and Nora felt that the words were not just heard, but implanted in her consciousness. The vessel of the pact, the bridge between worlds. Her eyes, wide and fixed on the statuette, were involuntarily drawn to her mother-in-law. The old woman, still unconscious, seemed frailer than ever, but now Nora saw in her not just a sick woman, but a receptacle of something immense, something sacred. The old woman's pale, feverish body seemed to emit a subtle, almost imperceptible aura, which Nora had previously attributed to feverish delirium, but which now revealed itself as a primordial energy, a calling. The tiger, which had previously lain over the mother-in-law, warming her with its massive body, was no longer just a predator. It was a guardian. The eagle with its steel talons and shrill cry also. They were not fighting for territory or food. They were defending the link, the vessel. The bear, then, was the threat, the imbalance, the force trying to break the pact. Nora's mind spun in a whirlwind of disbelief and dread. The pension, the revenge, the money. All of it was a cruel joke, an insignificant farce before the grandeur of that ancient secret. The voice continued, stronger now, as if the forest itself was speaking through it. The balance must be maintained. Her life is the life of the forest. The guardian's warmth protected her. The sky's fury defends her. The earth's darkness surrounds her. As the voice spoke, the statuette emitted a pulse of light so strong that Nora had to squint. The mist around the tree not only swirled, but began to condense into translucent forms, specters dancing at the edges of her vision. They were humanoid figures, with animalistic features, glowing eyes that seemed to watch her. They were not threatening, but their presence was overwhelming. charged with an antiquity that made time seem irrelevant. The ground beneath Nora trembled again, but this time it was not the bear, it was the earth itself, responding to the statuette's call, to the awakening of the pact. The surrounding trees seemed to lean, their gnarled branches like outstretched arms, their whispers joining the chorus of the ancient voice. The air grew heavy, charged with a mystical electricity that made Nora's hairs stand on end, not just from cold, but from a terrified reverence. The animal battle, which had previously seemed the center of Nora's universe, now became a mere distant echo. The bear's roar, the eagle's cry, the tiger's hiss. Everything mingled with the growing sound of the living forest, with the voice that filled her mind. The bear, in a last desperate attack, managed to severely wound the tiger, which let out a roar of pain and fury. But before the bear could deliver the final blow, the eagle descended with dizzying speed, its talons digging deeply into the terrestrial predator's neck. The bear stumbled, letting out a roar of agony that was abruptly cut short when the eagle, with supernatural strength, twisted its neck. The colossal body of the bear fell to the ground with a dull thud, life quickly draining from it. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. Only the voice in Nora's mind persisted, and the pulsating glow of the statuette. The tiger, wounded, limped towards the mother-in-law, lying down beside her again, as if its protective mission had never ceased. Despite its own pain, the eagle hovered for a moment over the bear's inert body before taking flight and disappearing into the mist like a winged spectre. Nora was in complete shock. The violence of the bear's death, the speed with which the battle ended, the animal's obedience to that invisible force. It was too much. Her mind, already at its limit, began to fragment. She crawled closer to the statuette, her hand outstretched, no longer out of curiosity, but out of a primordial desperation to cling to something tangible, something that could anchor her in that distorted reality. "You dared to profane," the voice whispered, and this time there was a sting of judgment, of icy coldness that made Nora's blood run cold. "You brought darkness where there should have been light, selfishness where there should have been reverence." Nora felt a shiver run down her spine. The voice was not just narrating, it was accusing. She was the intruder, the villain of that ancient story. The pension, the money, the envy, all seemed so small, so pathetic. She had dragged her mother-in-law to her death, but unknowingly had led her to the heart of a mystery that transcended her. Her fingers finally touched the statuette. The metal was cold, but a vibrant energy surged through her arm, rising to her chest, making her heart pound erratically. The small stones embedded in the statuette shone with blinding intensity, and the mist around the tree thickened even further, enveloping Nora in an opaque veil. The voice in her mind transformed, no longer a whisper, but a silent roar that shook her being. "You will see, you will feel, the price of profanation." Suddenly, the images that were previously peripheral and confused became vivid, real. Nora was no longer in the cold forest. She was being dragged into the visions. Gigantic trees that moved, not like plants, but like conscious beings, their branches twisting in agony. Glowing eyes in the darkness, not of animals, but of entities that watched her with ancient wisdom. Shadowy forms dancing, not in celebration, but in a ritual of lament and fury. She felt the forest's cold penetrate her bones in a way she had never experienced before, a cold that was not just physical, but that froze her soul. The smell of blood, damp earth, animal sweat intensified, but now it mingled with a different odor, a smell of decay and decomposing life, of an eternal cycle of death and rebirth that the forest guarded. The mother-in-law, beside the wounded tiger, seemed to have found a strange peace. Her lips moved an almost inaudible whisper, but which Nora felt in her mind like an echo of the forest's voice. "The pact. is broken. Nora's terror reached its peak. It was no longer the fear of death, but the fear of a punishment that transcended existence itself. She had broken something, profaned something sacred, and the forest, with its guardians and its ancient pact, was about to exact its price. The statuette in her hand pulsed, and the visions became clearer, more real, dragging her into a nightmare she had invoked. She was merely an insignificant piece in a cosmic game, and her fate, now, was sealed. Nora was no longer just touching the statuette. She was the statuette, and the statuette was her. The energy pulsing in her hand was not merely a vibration. It was the lifeblood of an ancient world, flowing through her veins, infusing her with a consciousness that was not her own. Her mother-in-law's whisper, "The pact is broken," was not a sound, but a fracture in reality itself, a shard that spread through her mind, opening fissures through which the purest terror began to seep. The trees, previously mere silhouettes in the mist, now rose like titans of flesh and bone, their trunks twisted into expressions of ancestral agony. Nora felt the viscous sap run down her own limbs, the rough bark scratching her skin, the slow, excruciating pain of roots being torn from the earth. She was not just seeing the trees move, she was the trees, feeling every inch of their forced growth, every branch broken by the wind, every leaf that fell like a tear. The cold, which had previously only numbed her, now pierced her, not like ice that freezes water, but like a cold that petrifies life, turning it into stone, into silence. The glowing eyes in the darkness were no longer distant. They surrounded her, thousands of them, in a tight, relentless circle. They were not animal eyes, but those of entities that had witnessed ages. And now their gazes were sharp blades that cut Nora's soul, exposing her insignificance, her malice. The ancient wisdom emanating from them was not a blessing, but a condemnation, a silent judgment that made her shrink within her own skin. She felt the pressure of these eyes, the weight of their history, the depth of their disappointment. The shadowy forms dancing in the mist were no longer specters. They were the very guardians of the pact, now freed from their bonds, but not in celebration. It was a ritual of lament, yes, but also of contained fury, a macabre dance of imminent vengeance. Nora saw their faces distorted by pain, their ethereal bodies writhing in an agony that seemed to echo her own. They did not touch her, but their presence was a constant touch, an icy embrace that pulled her into the abyss. The smell of the forest became unbearable. The blood, the damp earth, the animal sweat. Everything mingled with a miasma of decay and decomposing life that suffocated her. But it was not just the smell of death. It was the smell of profanation, the odor of something sacred being corrupted, of a balance being undone. She tasted the bitter tang of regret in her mouth, the metallic taste of fear, the smell of wet earth and rot invading her nostrils. It was the smell of the forest itself, dying and being reborn, and she was at the center of this cycle, an intruder, a parasite. The voice, which had previously been a silent roar, now became a chorus of 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison within her mind, in a language she understood without comprehending, a tongue that transcended sound. You broke the link, Nora. You tore the veil. The selfishness of a single heart wounded the soul of 1,000 worlds. The words were not just heard, they were felt, seared into her consciousness, each syllable a punishment. She tried to pull back, to remove her hand from the statuette, but her fingers were glued, fused to the cold, pulsating metal. It was as if the statuette had become an extension of her own body, a mystical parasite feeding on her terror. The glow of the embedded stones was no longer blinding. It was an internal light burning within her eyes, revealing even more terrible visions. She saw her mother-in-law, no longer as a sick old woman, but as a flickering beacon of light, a candle about to go out. The subtle aura that had previously surrounded her now seemed to crack, disintegrating into fragments of light. The pact was broken, and the mother-in-law, the vessel, was unraveling with it. The wounded tiger, still lying beside the elderly woman, let out a low moan, a sound of pain and despair. Its eyes, previously full of protective fury, now held a deep sadness, as if it knew its mission was failing, that the link was breaking. Nora felt a pang of guilt, an emotion she had long buried beneath layers of envy and resentment. But it was not just guilt, it was the weight of cosmic responsibility. She had condemned not just her mother-in-law, but the forest itself, the very balance. The voice intensified, echoing with the force of a primordial thunder. The price is not death, Nora. Death is a cycle. The price is disconnection, loss, the void you created. Suddenly, the visions changed. She was no longer feeling the pain of the forest. She was feeling the pain of loss. The loss of every creature that would die without the balance, the loss of every tree that would wither, the loss of the very essence of life. She saw rivers drying, skies darkening, the earth becoming barren, and in every image she saw her own face, distorted, selfish, the cause of all that desolation. The ground beneath her trembled again, but this time it was not the earth responding to the call. It was the earth weeping. The surrounding trees did not bow in reverence, but in a final farewell, their gnarled branches like hands bidding goodbye. The heavy air of mystical electricity was now a thin, suffocating air, as if the very oxygen was being sucked into a vacuum. Nora could no longer distinguish what was real and what was illusion. The forest, the statuette, the mother-in-law, the tiger. Everything merged into a single terrifying tapestry of pain and despair. She was trapped, not just physically, but spiritually, in a purgatory she herself had invoked. Her eyes, wide and bloodshot, fixed on her mother-in-law's pale face. The old woman, who should have been dead, now seemed different, no longer frail, but ethereal, almost translucent. Her lips moved again, but this time there was no whisper. There was only a faint light emanating from her body, a light that seemed to fight against the darkness Nora had brought. The tiger, with a last effort, raised its head and looked at Nora. Its golden eyes, previously full of fury, now gleamed with an intensity that made her tremble to her soul. It was not anger, it was a deep sadness, a comprehension of the fate that was befalling everyone. And then the tiger opened its mouth and a sound began to form. Not a battle roar, but a lament, a warning, a primordial cry that seemed to tear the very fabric of the universe. Nora felt the sound vibrate in her bones, in every cell of her body. It was the sound of the pact unraveling, the sound of the forest dying, the sound of her own condemnation. Terror reached a level that the human mind was not made to endure. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to run, but her limbs were paralyzed, bound to the statuette, to that portal to hell she had opened. The tiger's roar grew, filling the world, and Nora knew with a cold and absolute certainty that her end was near and that it would be far worse than death. The weight of the universe fell upon her. The tiger's lament was not a sound heard with the ears. It was a vibration that tore through the ether, a shockwave propagating through the very fabric of reality. It was not the roar of an animal, but the cry of a dying world, the primordial pain of the forest being torn apart. Nora felt her bones tremble, her internal organs writhe. Every cell of her body seemed to explode and reform in an endless cycle of agony. The air, already thin, now became a solid, pulsating mass, crushing her, tearing the breath from her lungs. She could not breathe, could not think, could not exist outside that omnipresent sound that consumed her. The statuette in her hand, previously just an object of power, now fused with her flesh, its veins intertwining with the cold lines of the metal, its embedded stones burning like hot coals in her palm. The energy emanating from it was no longer a pulsation. It was a torrent of fire and ice, rushing through her arteries, igniting her mind with even more vivid and unbearable visions. She saw the forest not just die, but disappear, evaporate into a mist of nothingness, taking with it all creatures, all trees, all life that once existed. And in the center of this void she saw herself, a solitary and grotesque figure, the sole survivor in a desert of her own creation. Fear, which had previously been a sharp knife, now became an icy ocean, drowning her in its depths. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry, her lips sealed by a paralyzing terror. She tried to move, to escape that hell she herself had invoked, but her muscles were rigid, her limbs heavy as lead, bound to the earth she had profaned. The statuette held her captive, an anchor to the abyss, and the tiger's voice, now a chorus of 1,000 ancient voices, echoed in her mind, not in words, but in pure condemnation. You are the void, Nora. You are the scar. The price of disconnection is the eternity of solitude. The surrounding trees, which had previously writhed in agony, now seemed to disintegrate into dust, their leaves turning to ashes that floated in the heavy air. The smell of rot and decay intensified to an unbearable point, invading her nostrils, her palate, as if she were breathing death itself. She felt the earth beneath her feet open, not into a physical abyss, but into a black hole of despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The glowing eyes in the darkness, the guardians of the pact, no longer watched her with judgment. They watched her with infinite sadness, with the resignation of those who witness the end of everything. And that sadness was worse than any fury, for it meant there was no more hope, no more redemption. Nora was the personification of ruin, the cause of desolation. The mother-in-law beside the tiger was now almost translucent, a mirage of flickering light. The aura that surrounded her completely dissolved, and she seemed to melt into the air, her contours becoming increasingly indistinct. Her lips moved one last time, and Nora, through the mystical connection of the statuette, felt the final word, a whisper that was not for her but for the forest: forgiveness. The tiger, its golden eyes fixed on Nora, let out one last thunderous lament. It was not a sound of anger, but of deep pain, of a farewell. And in that moment, Nora's mind shattered. The weight of the universe, the pain of the forest, the condemnation of the guardians, the loss of her mother-in-law, all merged into a single, unbearable point of terror. Her body could no longer endure. A silent scream tore through her throat, a sound only she could hear in her fragmented mind. Her eyes rolled back, and the statuette, which seemed to have become part of her, detached from her paralyzed fingers with a dry click. She fell backward, not with the grace of a collapsing body, but with the rigidity of a felled tree, hitting the damp ground with a dull thud. The mist, which had previously danced with shadowy forms, seemed to thicken, enveloping her in an icy shroud. The tiger's roar, which had filled the world, did not cease immediately, but transformed into a distant echo, a lament that seemed to recede into the depths of the forest, taking Nora's consciousness with it. She was unconscious, but the terror did not abandon her. In her mind, now a battlefield of fragments and shadows, the visions persisted. She no longer saw the forest dying. She was the forest dying. She felt the pain of roots being torn, sap drying in her veins, bark cracking on her skin. The cold was no longer external. It was a cold that came from within, freezing her very essence, transforming her into a statue of ice and despair. The statuette, fallen beside her inert hand, still pulsed faintly, but its glow had diminished, as if the source of its energy had been drained, or as if its purpose had been fulfilled. The forest, after the tiger's lament, seemed to have fallen into a sepulchral silence, a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. It was the silence of death, the silence of emptiness. The mother-in-law, now an almost imperceptible figure, seemed to have merged with the light, a last flickering spark before extinguishing completely. The tiger, exhausted, laid its head beside her, its golden eyes fixed on Nora's inert body, not with anger, but with a deep and weary melancholy. The mission was accomplished, but the price had been too high. Nora lay there, an empty shell, her body surrendered to the forest she had tried to destroy. But the forest did not want her. She was a stain, a profanation, and even in unconsciousness, the forest would not leave her in peace. The nightmare had only just begun. The silence was a promise of more horrors, a calm before the true storm that would descend upon her. She had broken the pact, and the forest, in its deadly silence, was only just beginning to exact its price. Nora's body lay inert on the damp, cold ground, a pale stain against the dark green of the dying forest. But unconsciousness, for her, was not a refuge, not an escape. It was merely the gateway to an even deeper abyss, a purgatory woven with the threads of her own selfishness and the pain she had sown. The nightmare, which had previously been a vision, had now become her own reality. In her fragmented mind, the forest's silence was not an absence of sound, but a deafening scream of emptiness. She no longer saw the trees disintegrating, she felt their roots twisting in her own bones, the sap of life draining from her veins like bitter tears. Her skin, once soft, now felt like the cracked bark of an ancient trunk, dry and lifeless, as the earth's cold permeated every cell, transforming her into a statue of ice and despair. The smell of rot and decay was no longer just an external sensation. It was her own breath, the taste in her mouth, the essence of her own corrupted existence. She was breathing death, eating death, being the death she had wished upon her mother-in-law, upon the forest, upon everything that opposed her greed. The statuette, fallen beside her hand, still pulsed, but with a dark, exhausted energy, like a dying heart that refused to stop beating, keeping her tied to a torment that transcended the physical. The tiger's golden eyes, now fixed on her, no longer carried the fury of a guardian, but the melancholy of a judge witnessing his own execution. He did not need to roar again. The condemnation had already been pronounced, and the forest, in its sepulchral silence, was only just beginning to exact its price. The mist, previously a mystical veil, now thickened around Nora's body, not to hide her, but to envelop her in an icy shroud, a mantle of oblivion and punishment. The mother-in-law, on the other hand, experienced a completely different fate. While Nora sank into her personal hell, the elder, now an almost imperceptible figure, seemed to merge with the light itself. Her contours dissolved, not in disintegration, but in a serene ascent. The aura that surrounded her, previously flickering, expanded into a soft, welcoming glow, like the last breath of a star, transforming into cosmic dust, but a dust that nourishes and gives life. Her lips moved one last time, and the word forgiveness, which Nora had felt, now echoed on an ethereal plane, not as a plea, but as a final blessing, a gift to the forest that had welcomed her and to the world she left behind. The tiger, with a heavy sigh that made the mist tremble slightly, laid its head beside the place where the mother-in-law had been, now just a faint trace of light. Its golden eyes, previously filled with infinite sadness, now reflected a resigned peace. It had fulfilled its role. The pact had been rebalanced, but at a cost the forest would feel for a long time. It did not move to attack Nora, nor to protect her. Its gaze was one of observation, of witness. Her fate was no longer in its paws, but in the invisible talons of nature itself, which she had defied. The statuette beside Nora's inert hand stopped pulsing. Its glow diminished until it extinguished completely, becoming just a cold, lifeless piece of metal, as if all its energy, all its malevolent power, had been sucked into the void that Nora had become. She was no longer the bearer of power. She was the receptacle of a curse. The silence that followed the mother-in-law's dissolution and the end of the tiger's lament was of a terrifying depth. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence, of irreparable loss. It was the sound of the forest closing in on itself, of its wounds contracting but not healing. And Nora, in her unconsciousness, felt every contraction, every pain, every emptiness. She was the echo of desolation, the living monument to her own ruin. The cold intensified, not just the cold of the night in the forest, but a cold that came from within, freezing her very essence, transforming her into a statue of ice and despair. The visions in her mind were no longer of death, but of an endless existence, trapped in a cycle of agony and regret. She had broken the pact, and the forest, in its deadly silence, was only just beginning to exact its price. The nightmare had only just begun, and Nora was trapped in it for all the eternity her mind could endure. Nora's mind, a battlefield of fragments and shadows, found no rest. Her inert body on the damp, cold ground was merely an anchor for a torment that extended beyond the flesh, into the depths of her own corrupted soul. The nightmare, which had previously been a vision, had now become her own reality, a purgatory woven with the threads of her selfishness and the pain she had sown. The silence of the forest, which had closed like a mortal wound, was not an absence of sound, but a deafening scream of emptiness that echoed in her internal ears. She no longer saw the trees disintegrating. She was the trees disintegrating. She felt their roots twisting in her own bones, every fiber of her being contracting in agony. The sap of life, previously a vital flow, drained from her veins like bitter tears, drying into a silent lament that only she could hear. Her skin, once soft and coveted, now felt like the cracked bark of an ancient trunk, dry and lifeless, each fissure a reminder of her own desolation. The earth's cold, which had previously invaded her limbs, now permeated every cell, transforming her into a statue of ice and despair, a frozen prison of her own creation. The statuette, fallen beside her hand, was now a cold, lifeless piece of metal, its glow extinguished, its energy drained. It was no longer an instrument of power, but a monument to her failure, a tangible reminder that the pact had been broken and the price paid. She was no longer the bearer of power. She was the receptacle of a curse, an empty shell where ambition once resided. As Nora sank into her personal hell, the elder, now an almost imperceptible figure, seemed to have merged with the light itself. Her contours dissolved, not in disintegration, but in a serene ascent, a return to the essence of life that Nora had tried to steal. The aura that surrounded her, previously flickering, expanded into a soft, welcoming glow, like the last breath of a star transforming into cosmic dust, but a dust that nourishes and gives life. Her lips moved one last time, and the word forgiveness, which Nora had felt, now echoed on an ethereal plane, not as a plea, but as a final blessing, a gift to the forest that had welcomed her and to the world she left behind. It was the perfect antithesis to Nora's torment, proof that light would always find a way, even in the deepest darkness. With each beat of her dying heart, Nora was forced to relive the moments of her greed, the cruel words, the dark thoughts that had led her to that point. There was no escape, no oblivion. Time had become an executioner, stretching each second into an eternity of guilt. She saw her mother-in-law's face, not with the fever and exhaustion that had dragged her there, but with the serenity of one who had found peace, a brutal contrast to her own torment. And that image, more than any other, was the knife twisting in her soul. The nightmare had only just begun, and Nora was trapped in it, for all the eternity her mind could endure. The forest, in its silent vengeance, would not kill her. It would keep her alive, conscious, so that every fiber of her being felt the pain of the destruction she had caused. She would be the eternal witness to her own ruin, an echo of despair in a world that slowly began to heal without her, and deep in her fragmented mind, a single terrible certainty formed. She deserved every second. Nora's agony was not the purifying fire of a purgatory, but the piercing ice of a private hell, forged by her own hands. Every beat of her dying heart, now a slow, heavy drum in her chest, was a countdown to an endless eternity. She was no longer an observer of her own ruin. She was the ruin, the personification of the void she had created. The cold, which had previously invaded her limbs, had now become the very essence of her being, freezing not just her flesh, but every thought, every memory, transforming them into stalactites of despair in her mind. Her skin, once coveted and soft, now felt like the cracked bark of an ancient trunk, dry and lifeless, each fissure a reminder of her own desolation. The smell of rot and decay was no longer just an external sensation. It was her own breath, the taste in her mouth, the essence of her own corrupted existence. She was breathing death, eating death, being the death she had wished upon her mother-in-law, upon the forest, upon everything that opposed her greed. Every inhalation was a gulp of poison, every exhalation a breath of despair lost in the dense, cold mist. The visions in her mind were no longer of death, but of an endless existence, trapped in a cycle of agony and regret. With each beat of her dying heart, Nora was forced to relive the moments of her greed, the cruel words, the dark thoughts that had led her to that point. There was no escape, no oblivion. Time had become an executioner, stretching each second into an eternity of guilt. She saw her mother-in-law's face, not with the fever and exhaustion that had dragged her there, but with the serenity of one who had found peace, a brutal contrast to her own torment. And that image, more than any other, was the knife twisting in her soul, a constant echo of the forgiveness that would haunt her forever. Nora's prison was not of bars or chains, but of flesh and consciousness, a private hell where time unfolded into an infinite tapestry of regret. Every beat of her dying heart, now a slow, heavy drum in her chest, was a countdown to an endless eternity, not of death, but of a perpetual near death. She was no longer an observer of her own ruin. She was the ruin, the personification of the void she had created, a living monument to her own desolation. The cold, which had previously invaded her limbs, had now become the very essence of her being, freezing not just her flesh, but every thought, every memory, transforming them into stalactites of despair in her mind. Her skin, once coveted and soft, now felt like the cracked bark of an ancient trunk, dry and lifeless, each fissure a reminder of her own desolation. The smell of rot and decay was no longer just an external sensation. It was her own breath, the taste in her mouth, the essence of her own corrupted existence. She was breathing death, eating death, being the death she had wished upon her mother-in-law, upon the forest, upon everything that opposed her greed. Every inhalation was a gulp of poison, every exhalation a breath of despair lost in the dense, cold mist. And deep in her fragmented mind, a single terrible certainty formed. She deserved every second. The forest, in its ancestral wisdom, would ensure she lived them one by one until the end of time. A prison of consciousness in a body that refused to die, yet no longer lived. Life, for Nora, was no longer a gift, but a perpetual condemnation. a burden of consciousness in a body that slowly disintegrated, inch by inch, under the impassive gaze of the tiger and the icy embrace of the forest. She would not be forgotten. She would be the living memory of a transgression, a whispered warning to anyone who dared to defy nature and its pacts. Her agony was the forest's new song, an eternal lament that mingled with the rustling leaves and the murmuring wind, a symphony of despair for centuries to come. But amidst this symphony of her own misfortune, a new sound began to infiltrate, subtle at first, then clearer, like a needle piercing the bubble of her torment. It was the sound of breathing, not her own, which was a drawn-out, painful wheeze, but a soft, rhythmic breath of someone sleeping peacefully. Nora's mind, fragmented and tortured, struggled to process this anomaly. How could there be peace in her hell? Slowly, as if emerging from a tar swamp, Nora's consciousness dragged itself out of her inner abyss, forced to witness the reality that surrounded her. Her eyes, previously fixed on internal visions, now opened to the mist, which seemed to recede just enough to reveal the cruelest scene of all. A few feet from her, the figure of her mother-in-law lay, no longer trembling with fever or cold, but enveloped in a cocoon of warmth and security. The giant tiger, the creature of her nightmares, lay upon the elderly woman, its golden, striped fur forming a protective mantle. The massive body of the feline, which Nora expected to be her executioner, radiated vital warmth, heating the old woman, whose face, previously pale and anguished, now displayed an almost angelic serenity. A slight smile played on her lips, and her breathing was calm and deep. It was an image of peace and protection that contrasted brutally with the icy, putrid hell in which Nora found herself. The tiger's warmth, which should have been hers, was now the refuge of the woman she had tried to destroy. With each soft breath of her mother-in-law, Nora felt a pang of ice in her own chest, an invisible knife twisting in her soul. The tiger, with its golden eyes, no longer looked at her with fury, but with an indifference that was even more devastating. It was as if she did not exist, as if she were merely an insignificant shadow on nature's stage, while life and compassion unfolded a few steps from her ruin. The forest, previously silent in its vengeance, now seemed to whisper with the life Nora had tried to extinguish. The rustling of leaves, the murmuring of the wind, the distant song of a bird, all these sounds previously muffled by her despair, now seemed to mock her condition, a melody of life she could no longer share. She was the dissonance, the false note in a symphony of healing and renewal. The forgiveness that echoed in her mind was no longer just a memory of her guilt, but a silent scream for a redemption that would never come. She had been condemned not to death, but to witness life flourish where she had sown destruction. The statuette, still in her hand, seemed to vibrate with negative energy, a constant reminder of the broken pact, of the force she had tried to manipulate and which now consumed her. Nora felt her body sink further into the damp earth, every fiber of her being surrendering to gravity, to the dampness, to decay. But her mind remained clear, agonizingly clear, forced to observe the miracle of life and protection unfolding before her. She was the witness to her own punishment, the echo of a mistake that the forest would never allow to be forgotten. And as her mother-in-law slept peacefully under the tiger's warmth, Nora felt the cold of eternity permeate her bones, an eternity of regret, a prison of consciousness in a body that refused to die, yet no longer lived, so that she could feel every second of the life she had denied to others, and which was now denied to her in her own existence. With each erratic beat of Nora's dying heart, the cold seemed to deepen, no longer just on the skin, but in the very fibers of her being, freezing the marrow of her bones, solidifying the blood in her veins. She no longer felt the sharp pain of an injury, but the slow, corrosive agony of a body disintegrating while alive, millimeter by millimeter, under the icy embrace of the earth. Every muscle, every nerve seemed to writhe in a silent spasm, a macabre dance of decay that only she could feel. The forest's dampness, previously a mere discomfort, had become a suffocating presence, infiltrating her lungs, transforming each inhalation into a Herculean effort, a gulp of icy water that drowned her soul instead of quenching it. Her mind, however, remained an island of lucid torment amidst the ocean of her crumbling body. The visions were no longer intermittent, but a continuous tapestry of her worst deeds woven with threads of guilt and regret. She saw her mother-in-law's face, not the sick, frail face she had dragged into the forest, but the young, vibrant face of years ago when the old woman was still a figure of respect and affection. She saw the smiles she had ignored, the kind words she had scorned, the gestures of love she had turned into opportunities for her own greed. Every memory was a dagger thrust, every recollection a poison spreading, amplifying the emptiness in her chest. And a few feet away, the scene repeated itself, a living tableau of peace and protection that was the inverted mirror of her own hell. Her mother-in-law, enveloped in the tiger's golden warmth, slept soundly. A soft sigh escaped the elderly woman's lips, a sound of pure contentment that pierced Nora's bubble of despair like an icy dart. The slight smile on her face, previously just a detail, now seemed a sneer, irrefutable proof of the redemption nature had granted the innocent and denied the guilty. The warmth emanating from the feline's massive body, visible in the mist slowly dissipating around them, was an invisible barrier, a flaming wall separating life from death, peace from torment. The tiger, with its golden eyes, no longer looked at her with the fury of a guardian, nor with the indifference of a judge. Now there was an almost melancholic depth in its gaze, as if it witnessed not only the punishment, but its inevitability. It was a look that said, "You made your bed, and now you must lie in it for all eternity." There was no anger, only a cold, imposing acceptance of the fate Nora had forged for herself. He was the guardian of the pact, and the pact had been fulfilled, in a way Nora could never have foreseen. The forest, which had previously seemed a silent accomplice to her vengeance, now stood as her executioner. The rustling of leaves, previously an indistinct murmur, transformed into accusing whispers, each falling leaf a reminder of the life she had tried to extinguish. The distant song of a bird, previously muffled by her despair, now sounded like a melody of triumph, a celebration of life that persisted despite her malice. The smell of damp earth and rot, which had previously been her own breath, now intensified, enveloping her in a shroud of decay, a constant reminder that she was the only thing decomposing in that scene of renewal. The statuette, still cold and lifeless in her paralyzed hand, seemed to weigh a ton, a metallic burden symbolizing the weight of her own soul. Its extinguished glow was the perfect metaphor for the energy she had tried to manipulate, and which now consumed her. It was no longer an instrument of power, but an anchor, pulling her into the depths of her own ruin, a monument to her failure, a tangible reminder that the pact had been broken and the price paid. The negative vibrations emanating from it were no longer a premonition, but a reality, a constant flow of despair that permeated every cell of her body. Time for Nora was no longer a linear progression, but an executioner stretching each second into an eternity of guilt. She was not just trapped in a nightmare, she was the nightmare, the personification of agony, a burden of consciousness in a body that refused to die, yet no longer lived. Life, for her, was no longer a gift, but a perpetual condemnation. A prison of consciousness in a body that slowly disintegrated, millimeter by millimeter, under the impassive gaze of the tiger and the icy embrace of the forest. She would not be forgotten. She would be the living memory of a transgression, a whispered warning to anyone who dared to defy nature and its pacts. Her agony was the forest's new song, an eternal lament that mingled with the rustling leaves and the murmuring wind, a symphony of despair for centuries to come. And as her mother-in-law slept peacefully under the tiger's warmth, Nora felt the cold of eternity permeate her bones. An eternity of regret, a prison of consciousness in a body that refused to die, yet no longer lived, so that she could feel every second of the life she had denied to others, and which was now denied to her in her own existence. The mist, which had previously seemed a mysterious veil, now closed over her like a shroud, sealing her fate in an oblivion that would never come, only the perpetual consciousness of her own ruin. The mist, which had previously seemed a mysterious veil, now closed over her like a shroud, sealing her fate in an oblivion that would never come, only the perpetual consciousness of her own ruin. Every fiber of her being, previously pulsating with the life she had tried to steal, now contracted in a slow and interminable spasm, a macabre dance of decay that only she could feel. The cold, which had already penetrated the marrow of her bones, now seemed to solidify time itself, stretching each second into an eternity of agony. It was no longer the sharp pain of an injury, but the incessant corrosion of a body disintegrating while alive, millimeter by millimeter, under the icy embrace of the earth.